Hello, and welcome back to the second part of the Unity 6 beginner tutorial series of making Yahtzee in Unity. In the last video, we set up a basic rolling mechanism for the dice and applied results to a simple UI. And we were able to lock the dice you don't want to throw anymore. In this second part, we are going to set up the calculations of the scores and add some additional UI for this. We will start by setting up the UI for a mobile device in portrait mode. On the top of your viewport, select Game and set it to Simulator. As you can see, this is not really the result we were looking for. We can solve that by selecting the main UI game objects in the hierarchy. And in the inspector, double-click on the panel settings. Here we can set the scale mode to scale with screen size. And now it looks a lot better. Next, we will add a list of score possibilities up here. For each score possibility, we will need to add an extra line. To do this, we will first go back to the asset folder and create a new folder called resources. In this folder, we will create a new UI document file and we will call it scoreline. Double click it to open it up in the UI builder. Now, drag a visual element into the hierarchy and call it scoreline. And in there, I will add another visual element, which we can later use as an icon. Now I'll add two labels, one to show the score and one to add a description. Name the visual element icon. The first label will be score label and the second label will be description label. As you can see, the icon takes up almost all the space and the labels are pushed down. To change that, we will first link up our style sheet. So press the plus button on top and select Add Existing USS. Browse to our style sheet. Then select the score line and add a new class in the inspector called scoreline. And add the new class also to the style sheet. We'll start by changing the size. Set the height to 100 pixels. When we now hover over the score line, it still takes up all the space. This is because the visual elements we added both have flex grow set to 1. So let's remove that. Now select the scoreline class and on the flex set direction to row. Let's add a reference to the icon in the style sheet by typing .scoreline #icon. With that selected, we can set both the width and the height to 100 pixels. And add a background color so we can actually see something. To the scoreline, I want to add some margins. So select the class and go to spacing in the inspector. And set margin to 10 pixels. For the score label, we will also add a reference by typing .scoreline #score label. And do the same for the description by .scoreline #description label. For the score label, we will set the size to 100 by 100 pixels. And in the text properties, align it to the center. Make the font size bigger. Let's do 70. And set the text to 0. As for the description, set the font size to 50 and center the vertical alignment. Perfect, this will do for now. Save the changes and go back to the simulator. Create a new script in the script folder called scoreline and open it up. First thing we need to do is let this class inherit from visual elements. And now add a constructor. And to link it up to the UI document we just created, we can write scoreline equals resources.load with a type of visual tree asset and a name we gave the UI document, which would be scoreline. And on the next line, write scoreline.cloneTree with this between the brackets. Now we can create an instance of this class and use the UI we created. We will start by adding the score lines to the UI. To do this, go to the main UI in the UI builder. Here we can add an extra visual element and move it to the top. Give it a name I will call it score element. To keep things organized, I will name the other visual elements as well. The middle one I will call buttons element, and the bottom one I will call dice element. The score element needs to take up most of the space, so for that I will make sure that the default flex grow property for the other two visual elements is turned off. This way the score element can take up all the space it needs, as you can see here. Now let's go back to the game manager. Here we will start by creating a new private method called initializeGame. We will copy initialize dice there and set up buttons as well, and call initialize scorecard from this method. Now we can create this initialize scorecard method as a private method. In this method we will get a reference to the scorecard element from the main UI by adding a query on the root for visual elements. And for the name we can put the name scorecard element. The name is a little bit different than what we use in the UI, but I think this describes it a bit better. So to make that work we will change this in the main UI as well, before we continue. Back in the game manager script we will also create a new instance for scoreline. And we will add the new scoreline to the scorecard element. This way we can test if it is all working as expected. And we shouldn't forget to call the initializeGame method from the start method. Go back to Unity and let's run the game to see if the scoreline is now included in the UI. And here it is, right on the top. Now let's go to the scoreline script. We will now add some parameters in the scoreline constructor. The first one will be of type string, called description. We also want to add an enum that we still have to create, but we can add it here already. Call it score enum. For the icon in the future, we can add one called icon of type texture 2D. And finally, we want to have a reference to the game manager in the constructor. So now let's first create a score enum. In Unity, go back to the scripts folder, add a new script and call it score enum. And open it up. Change class to enum. And here we can add all the possible dice combinations that exist in Yahtzee. First we have the ones. This will count all the dice with the value of 1. And the same goes for the 2s, the 3s, 4s, 5s and 6s. Next up is 3 of a kind. This will be a possible score when there are 3 dice with the same value. Similar to that is 4 of a kind. Then we have a full house, which is with 3 and 2 of the same kind. The small straight is 4 dice in a row. And the large straight is 5 dice in a row. Yahtzee is when you have 5 dice with the same value. And finally we have chance, where you can just add up all the points thrown. The error in the scoreline for the score enum is now gone. But now we will get an error in the game manager script, because we didn't add the correct data for the scoreline. Let's first change the name to score once. For the description we can now add once, then call the score enum dot once. The image we will skip for now, so you can just write null. And to reference the game manager we can just write this. Replace the scoreline with score once, and we can now copy this and adjust them all for the different score options we have. I've paused the recording and added all the options. So when we now run a game, it will show multiple score lines. They all look the same because we didn't connect anything in the scoreline script yet. So let's do that now. We will start with the description. For this, create a variable called description label. Write this.q with a type of label, and for the name, the description label. Then description label.text is description. When we now run the game, all the descriptions are visible. Next, we go back to the game manager and add a public action with an integer array return type. And give it the name onDiceRolled. With this action created, we can go down to the rollAllDice method to make some modifications. We start by creating an integer array called dice values. And there will be 5 items in the array, our 5 dice. In the for loop, we can add the result to the array by calling it with iteration of the loop. Below the for loop, we call our action by typing onDiceRolled question mark dot invoke with a value of dice values. Let's go back to the scrollline script. Here we can now subscribe to the action by writing game manager dot onRiseDold plus equals update score, which doesn't exist yet, so we can create that right now as a private method. And we want to get an integer array here called dice values. In this method, we will create a switch to check all the score possibilities. But for this, we first need to store our enum list, so create a private score enum and assign it in the constructor. We can now use this in our switch so that each score line will use the right formula to calculate the possible score. So now we can add for each possibility a case. I will pause the recording again to add all of them. I've created all the cases. Now it's time to create the different calculations for the scores. For this, I will create a new script called score calculator and open it up. I will make the class static. Now, the first calculation we will add is for the numbers, so 1 to 6. This can all be done in one calculation. Usually in Yahtzee, these numbers are on the upper section of the score sheet, so I will use that term now as well. So let's make a public static method with an integer as return type called calculate upper section score. As parameters, we will add an integer array and call it dice values, and we want to know for which number we need to calculate, so we want an integer called target number. We want to select all the dice values in the array with the same value as our target number. We can do that by calling dice values.where value equals bigger than value equals target number, add .sum to the end to get the total sum of those dice, and just return this line. Let's go back to the scoreline script and apply it to the 6 numbers. In the case for the ones, add score calculator dot calculate upper section score, add the dice values and add a 1. To actually be able to see the results, we need to first store the score label somewhere. So on top, add a private label called score label, and in the constructor, get it by writing score label equals this.q of type label and with the name of score label. Then in the ones case, in front of the calculate score line, add score label.text equals and add toString at the end. Now copy this line and add it to the other numbers and make sure to change the target number. Save this and now let's see how it looks like. Start the game and roll the dice. Now you see the scores shown in the list. 2 points for the ones, we can start 2 ones in the result. 6 points for threes, we can start 2 threes in the results. And 5 points for fives, because there's only 1 5. So this seems to work the way we want it to work. Let's go back to the calculator script. Here we can now add a method to calculate the 3 and 4 of a kind. Call it isN of a kind and make sure it has an integer return type. And the dice values as a parameter. And an integer we call n to tell if it's a 3 or a 4 of a kind. We will start by grouping the results by value. And then we check if there is a group that is bigger than the n value. This line will give us back a true or a false, but we need a score to return. Add a question mark behind it to make it an if statement. The first part would be called when it's true, so we add dice values.sum, add a colon, then type a 0 for the false result. And we have to return this as well. Go back to the scoreline script, call this method from the 3 of a kind, and copy it to 4 of a kind and change the number. Play the game and roll the dice. We have a 3 of a kind with 4s. See how the score is now the total sum of the dice there. Lock the 4s and see if you can get a 4 of a kind as well. Now we also have a 4 of a kind, and that also seems to be correct. Next up is the full house. Back to the score calculator and create a method for that called isFullHouse. Here we only need the dice values. We first need to get the groups in the dice values, same as we did before, and make it to a list. If there would be a full house in the values, we should have two groups now in the groups list. So we can return groups.count equals 2. But because it could also be a group of 4 and 1, we need to check the size of the groups. So add and groups 0.count equals 3 or groups 1.count equals 3. Also make this into an if statement with question mark. The true value will be 25, which is the default score in Yahtzee for a full house, and the false value will of course be 0. Now add it to the switch in the scoreline script. Back to the score calculator and add a method for the small straight. Call it isSmallStraight with only the dice values as a parameter. The first thing we want to do is get the unique values of the dice by using distinct, and order them by the values to see if we have a possible straight, and store that in an array. Now we'll make a string sequence by using string.join, an empty string, and then unique values. We now can compare the sequence to the possibilities of the small straight, so return sequence.contains 1, 2, 3, 4, or sequence.contains 2, 3, 4, 5, or contains 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, make this an if statement with a question mark. If it's true, we return 30 points. When it's false, we return 0 points. Add this one to the switch as well. The next one will be the large straight. It will be very similar. So let's copy the code from the small straight. Change 1, 2, 3, 4 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 2, 3, 4, 5 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we can remove the last option since there are only two possible options. And the score for the large straight is 40. Add this one to the switch as well. Now, the last two to create. First up is the Yahtzee. So make a method called isYahtzee with the dice values as a parameter. This can be done easily by applying a distinct on the dice values. Then count how many different values there are left. That should be 1, because all 5 dice should have the same value. Make it an if statement. If it's true, give it 50 points, otherwise 0 points. Now let's do the last one right now as well. Call the method calculate chance score, and you can just return the sum of all the values. Now add these last two also to the switch and scoreline. With all possible calculations, we can go back to the game and see if they all work. The numbers 3 and 4 of a kind we already did, so let's focus on the rest. Let's roll the dice. Small straight seems to work with a combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, and chance adds up all the points together. Lock the values of the small straight and see if we can make it a large one. And there is the 5 to make it a large straight. So that works as well. Unlock all dice and let's try to get a full house or a Yahtzee. Now let's lock the 2s. And now we can lock the 6s. So here we have now the full house with 6s and 2s. Now unlock the 6s and lock the third 2, so we can try to get a Yahtzee. There's another 2, so lock that as well. And here is a Yahtzee with 5 2s. All the scores work the way we want to. With this, I will wrap it up for this video. In the next video, we are going to continue and make it more like a real game. If you like this video, please press the like button and subscribe to get notified when the next video is released. So, hope to see you there.